Hello, my name is Ian Kinder. I'm the owner of Live Safe Academy. Thank you very much for joining us for this after podcast show. The podcast that we're featuring in this video is podcast number 6, How to Select a Handgun for Self-Defense. And my guest today is Lou Kyoto of Gunfighters Limited. Now, I love these podcast shows, these after podcast shows, because what we're going to do here is come on this video and we're going to discuss the same topics that we discussed in the podcast. And this is a resource that you can use by itself, or it's a resource that you can use in conjunction with the podcast, just like you can use the podcast as a standalone resource. And the idea here is we're going to have the same discussion, but we may elaborate on different things. We may focus in on some things that we didn't focus in on the podcast, while still covering the same basic information. And what I really love about this after podcast show is it suits the topic, because I'm going to be able to show you things, Lou's going to be able to show you things that you can't hear in an audio presentation. So this is going to be a great show. I appreciate you taking the time to watch us. And let me go right to introducing Lou. Lou, thank you very much for being here today. How are you, sir?
I'm very well, Ian. Glad to be here. Look forward to the presentation.
Well, you know, this is such an important topic, and we talked about this in a podcast also. Handgun selection is a critical issue for a number of reasons. First of all, guns are expensive, and we don't want to go out there and make the wrong choice. But what's more important than that is the guns that we use can dramatically impact our proficiency. And because we're talking about handgun selection for self-defense, that now becomes a safety issue. It becomes a matter of life and death. So we really want to make sure that people out there are informed about the decisions that we're making. And we also want to be very careful to say that this is not about one gun being better than the other gun, or one caliber being better than the other caliber. There's a lot of individual criteria that go into a person's selection. We're just here to inform people on what their options are and talk about some of the considerations when they're making those choices. So we're going to go over real basic here, as though somebody has no knowledge about handguns at all, and then we're going to build into the different protocol or concepts or criteria that people want to use when they're making that selection. So I guess we'll start with action type, Lou, but before we do that, do you want to make any general comments about this issue of selecting a handgun specifically for self-defense?
Yes, I sure would. I think this is such an important topic, because the handguns that we select to use for our self-defense, if you're in law enforcement, your duty purposes, home defense, all of it is very, very important to make sure that we've made the right choices based on our needs, our abilities with that handgun, the way it fits in our hand. All of these issues come together to form part of our defensive system. If we plug in the wrong tool that doesn't work well with us, then our performance levels are always going to be lagging. So what we try to do when we talk about this topic of selecting a handgun is get something that works for us, so that our training will be maximized, so our ability to put the bullets on target will be maximized, so that we're not having performance problems based on the equipment that we select.
I could not agree more. And teaching a lot of students in the use of a handgun, I can tell you, I see this all the time. People come in with guns that are very difficult for them to shoot. Now, with enough practice, they can overcome that. But then if they select another handgun right away, they can shoot it effectively. And you want all of your practice to really maximize your proficiency. You don't want to spend practice time on overcoming the obstacle of the gun that you're using. So we always want our guns to enhance our fundamentals. We don't want the gun to fight our fundamentals. Let's talk first here about some real basics when we talk about action types. And the first thing we're going to talk about here is a revolver. Now, I got a big revolver here, a 44, that people can kind of use to see what the idea of a revolver is. A revolver is called a revolver because the cylinder here revolves, and that's the action of the gun. Now, another option here that people have to choose from is an automatic. Now, automatic is more of its technical term. It's not really a term that people use anymore. People more commonly call it today a semi-automatic or an autoloader. All of those terms are fine, but this is technically an automatic, and this is another action type. Now, when we talk about selecting just between those two types alone, it's really going to depend on what your ultimate objective is for that gun. And I know, Lou, we're going to talk about the missions of the gun as we go in a little bit more detail later. But those are the two basic options that you have to understand. And then the next thing you need to understand is the trigger type. And we have three basic types of trigger. We have a double action. That's where the trigger is going to cock and release the hammer. We have a single action trigger where the trigger only releases the hammer. Now, when we talk about a double or a single action trigger, the double action trigger is longer and it's heavier. So it's oftentimes harder for people to use. A single action trigger is shorter and lighter, so it's usually easier for people to use, but it can become more complicated to use, and I'm going to explain that in more detail in just a moment. But let's talk about the next action type, and that's a double single trigger. A double single trigger is where the trigger will either release the hammer or it will cock and release the hammer. Now, this is something that you would see in an automatic, because what will happen here is when you carry it, you would carry this particular gun with the hammer down. The first time you shoot it, it'll fire in double action, but then when the slide cycles, the hammer is cocked so that all of your follow-up shots are in single action. Now, the challenge with that design is it creates a difference between the first shot and every other shot, the first shot being in double action and every other shot being in single action. That wouldn't seem like a big deal, but Lou, maybe you can elaborate on this. Every police department that I'm aware of, when they try to use a double single action, they have proficiency issues with consistency between that first shot and follow-up shots. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, having to carry a double to single action trigger for a number of years in police service, I observed this issue that you're talking about with the proficiency level being somewhat challenged when we have to use a long, heavy double action for the first shot and then have that shorter, lighter single action for all the subsequent shots. Part of the problem with it is not only from the action itself, but when we talk about the size of the grip of a particular weapon that's used, the amount of pressure needed to be able to pull that first double action trigger, it sometimes causes a problem in the way that the weapon actually fits in the person's hands. What I mean by that is that in order to reach the trigger, having an appropriate finger position on the trigger based on the size of the grip of that weapon may cause the hand to slip a little bit around the side of the grip. Now, what happens is that grip works for that first shot as far as being able to have the power enough to pull the trigger back and have your finger in the right position. But then for every subsequent shot after that, when we get down into single action, your hand is actually not in a proper position for all those subsequent shots. So in essence, what you do is, in order to fit the weapon for the first shot, you have to get an improper grip on the weapon, and then that grip stays on it through whatever shots you've gone out of that magazine until you stop shooting. So for someone that is going to be challenged in that way via their hand size and the way it fits that particular weapon, it's going to affect your proficiency, because now the weapon's not pointing naturally for you. You're still contending with the heavy double action and the lighter single action between first and second shots, which now can affect a different point of impact downrange between those first two shots. So it opens up a Pandora's box of problems. Now, these problems can be overcome, but the problem with overcoming them is that it generally requires a tremendous amount of practice to do it. Some people might require a little bit more, some less. But the one consistent thing is that it always is going to require more than, let's say, a weapon system that fits better It may have a more consistent trigger pull from shot to shot.
When one of our fundamental criteria when we're selecting a handgun is consistency. We want things to be the same as much as possible. So we're not saying a double action, single action gun is a bad gun, but there are those things that we have to now consider that are going to now, because there are those inconsistencies from the first shot to the follow-up shot, that now have to be taken into account with training. And there are some other complications involved with the design like that too. But let me be clear, when we talk about the two different action types, we got the revolver, we have the automatic, the semi-automatic, the autoloader over here. Then we have the trigger types. Those trigger types can be on either side, a revolver or an autoloader. So what I mean is the double action or the single action trigger, the trigger that both cocks and releases the hammer, and the single action where the trigger only releases the hammer, that can be in both an autoloader and also a revolver. Now that double single action trigger, that's only going to be in an autoloader that you just saw right now, where when I pull the hammer, the trigger the first time, cocks and releases, but the slide is going to cycle it every time with the hammer back, so now it's only releasing. That particular feature you're only going to see in an automatic. But Lou, I showed what a single action looked like in an autoloader. Can you show me what a single action would look like in a revolver so that people can see that double action and single action is available in both revolvers and autoloaders?
Oh, sure. Well, what I have to show you here is a Colt Peacekeeper. And it is, the classic Western style revolver. Just to ensure safety with it, in order to check the cylinders, we have to open up our cylinder latch, somewhat cock it back to a position to where it's in a half-cocked position, and I can now check to see that the cylinders are all clear. Once that's done, I can release the trigger. Now, for this particular action, in order for me to fire it, I have to manually cock this into its single action position, and then every time I pull the trigger, the hammer is going to stay forward, and in order to shoot again, I would have to cock it manually. So basically, I have to use my thumb to be able to keep this particular weapon running. And in this model is a 6-shot 45 long Colt version. This is an original Colt, very well-made weapon, and probably one of the tightest shooting revolvers I've ever used. But this is how the action works. It has to be manually cocked each and every time, as opposed to a single action semi-auto such as a 1911 design, where once the hammer is initially cocked via the slide being pulled back to the rear, or you manually thumb cocking it, every shot is going to be automatically cocked for you. This has to be done manually by your own thumb.
So for the 1911 as an example, when we talk about this gun, you see here the hammer is back, the trigger will release it, but like the revolver that you just showed, which is single action, the trigger can't cock the hammer. When you fire the gun and the slide goes back, the slide is what cocks the hammer, so that now when you activate the trigger is only releasing the hammer. So see, there you have that single action design, both in an automatic and a revolver. What makes it single action is that the trigger only releases the hammer, where in a double action, the trigger both cocks and releases the hammer. Now, because a double action trigger is longer and heavier, and a single action trigger is shorter and lighter, the natural assumption that some people might make is that the single action is a better design. But there's a couple issues you have to be aware of. First of all, for some people, they're very comfortable with guns in a double action trigger, and that's fine. If somebody is comfortable with that, then that's a perfectly valid option for them. With a single action trigger, though it is lighter and shorter and easier to shoot, you now have certain issues, because what are you going to do with that hammer? You're not going to carry it cocked back all the time unless you're doing something to make that safe. So with that old-fashioned single action revolver, which is not a modern self-defense gun, that would be a gun that people would associate with the Old West, the hammer would be carried down, and then when somebody wanted to shoot it, they would have to manually cock the hammer so that now they could pull the trigger and they can fire the gun. With a gun like this, because it's a double action, single action, that means when the hammer is down, it's going to cock and release, but then the slide cycling is going to put it into a single action. But the problem with this is once you're done shooting, you can't leave that hammer back because that would be unsafe. That's not how the gun is designed to be used. So what this gun is designed to use is a decocking device that looks like it might be kind of hard to see on the screen. But the idea with this decocking device here is you would now take this and bring it down, and then that would release the hammer in a way that wouldn't fire the gun by accident. Now the challenge that that creates is, you know, in training, it's not such a big deal. You just have to remind yourself that every time I get done shooting, I have to release the hammer before I holster the gun. But that does create now another burden in training, something that people have to remember. But as a training issue, it can be overcome, and people do, in fact, practice so that they can make that part of their protocol. The problem is in a real shooting, when somebody just tried to kill you, now you're afraid, and you've got to remember that you've got to decock that hammer before you put it back into the holster. That's where people are very likely to forget, particularly if they're not practicing with it all the time, and now you've got that hammer back in that unsafe position. What that creates is a complication, and we always want to look for simplicity as another one of our fundamentals for selecting a handgun. So now we have the inconsistency of a double action trigger, single action follow-up shots, and we have the the additional it's complex, and that we have to now remember, not just in training but in a real shooting, to let that hammer come down before we holster our weapon. That makes it more complicated. Now let me just show one more issue here. With a 1911, the way that this gun is designed to be used is to have the hammer already carried back so that the gun is loaded and ready to go. But because this would be unsafe, you have a manual safety that you would engage so that the trigger can't discharge. The trigger can't discharge with the safety engaged. And then you have to manually disengage the safety before you can fire the gun. And that's how this gun is designed to be carried with the hammer back ready to fire. Unlike the other gun where the gun is designed to be carried with the hammer down, and then you have to remember to release the hammer when you're done. With this, you have to remember to engage and disengage the safety. But as we talked about, I'm sure in other podcasts or videos, or we will today, that creates another complication. People have to remember when somebody's trying to kill them that they have to disengage their safety before they can effectively engage the threat. Now, on the range, people can get to the point where they train themselves, or that becomes an automatic part of their shooting sequence. But in the real shooting, even when people practice it consistently on the range, there have been many documented cases where people have died because they were not able to discharge their gun because they didn't remember to disengage their safety. Remember that 1,000,000 times in training is not one time in a real situation. In training, your intellectual brain is engaged. That's your problem solver. Under stress, you're operating off of your primitive brain, which is reactionary, not analytical. And the natural instinct in a real shooting is to grab the gun, to point the gun, to shoot the gun. Anything you add to that creates the potential for a performance issue, and in a real fight that can cost you your safety or the safety of another innocent person. Now, I'm not saying that the 1911 is a bad gun. It is a phenomenal gun, and it's a proven weapon system. That gun has been used for, what are we looking at, almost over 100 years. This gun has been used effectively in combat, including conflicts like World War I and World War II. No criticism of that weapon system. It is a phenomenal platform. But it is a platform that creates with it additional challenges, additional complexity that now have to be overcome in training. And, we want our training to pay off immediately with a simple, consistent design. We want to be very careful about using a weapon system that requires more training and that could cause performance issues in a real fight. Lou, what are your thoughts about that? Because I know, like me, you're a big fan of the weapon system, but there are also concerns that we have to think about if we want to choose that weapon system over other options.
Sure. Well, let me try to approach it from this standpoint. Every one of these weapons, probably just with the exception of the single action uh, Colt Western style, are all very effective weapons that we see used in the modern self-defense mode. It's not saying that that single action cannot be used in a defensive role. It's just that you just don't really see it that much anymore. I try to look at this from the standpoint that all of these weapons are viable. They are all in use by large police agencies, by people who are carrying in the concealed carry mode. The problem is in the training. And you hit on a very important point about complexities. Complex things require a lot more intense training than non-complex things. Anytime you start to add more to the picture, so to speak, now you have to account for that in your frequency of training, your level of training, the type of training that we try to always associate with reality is force-on-force type training. As an example, with the weapon such as a 1911, where you're using a manual safety that has to be disengaged, this has been done for, like you said, over 100 years. However, many people have never used that particular system in any kind of force-on-force training. So their use of it has been exclusively on a range. Now, what we see happen in a lot of force-on-force scenarios sometimes causes more complexity than what we see on a live range where everything is being very well controlled. The environment that you're working in is generally at a very low stress level. So people have more of a chance to mentally prepare for what they're doing. Now, my advice always is with if you're adding a complex weapon system such as a 1911 as opposed to maybe something where you just point and pull the trigger, then you should at some point in your training get involved in force-on-force training so you can test that entire system in your hand under more stressful environments. This way you're not surprised by what's going to be there. Of course, we can train people up to do almost anything, but the training time has to be available to overcome these complexities. And if you're not willing to put the training time into overcoming the complexities, you're probably better off choosing something else, and that would be more for your own safety.
Well, and a comparison I'd like to make is with that single-action revolver that you have, Lou. Now, that's a beautiful gun. We're both fans of that design. That's a proven system. A lot of people fought with that design, and even today, if you look at a lot of the competitive shooters out there, there are some people that are extremely devastating with that single-action design revolver. But is the average person going to want to make that their primary fighting gun? It's a proven system. There's a lot of people that are very talented with that design even today, but it's a more complicated system, and I think most people would agree that they wouldn't want to make that their primary gun as a self-defense gun in a modern scenario. So anytime that we talk about these considerations, please understand we're not being critical. There's not a gun here that we're going to show you that we're not, that we're not big fans of ourselves. But for the end user, for the person that's going to hear this advice and or this information and make that personal selection, we just want to give them an honest understanding of what are we looking at as a criteria for selecting. Simplicity and also consistency are two really big fundamentals that will make performance much better in a real scenario, particularly with minimal training. And Lou, if I can introduce one more action type, which is our final action type here, and then we can go into some other concepts, is a striker fire weapon. Now, a striker fire weapon is a different design where what's going to happen here is the trigger is always consistent. The gun is going to The slide's going to cycle to reset the trigger, but this is not a double action, it's not a single action, it's a different type of design. And this gives us a lot of advantages here because now we have a very simple design that is consistent All we're doing is activating the trigger. The trigger is the same for every shot, and the trigger is short and light. So, Lou, can you talk about what are some of the mechanical differences that make it a striker fire weapon as opposed to these other designs here that I showed, which are single action, double action, or the double single triggers?
Well, when we look at a striker weapon such as the Glock that you just demonstrated, and there are others, Smith & Wesson makes the M&P system. The Springfield Armory makes their version, and there are many others out there that people are using. I think what it does for the end user is makes it fairly easy to use under stress. Once you have a chambered round, your finger becomes a safety, meaning, with most training programs that we see in existence now, finger straight off the trigger is the registered place of that finger until you're ready to fire the weapon. With that said, all that you have to do to be able to engage a threat with a striker fired weapon is point it in the direction of the hostile that you're trying to engage, pull the trigger, release the trigger, and pull it again as many times as you need it. The trigger itself is consistent from shot to shot, meaning it's exactly the same every time you pull the trigger. So as we're training someone, we're not needing to worry about teaching two different trigger pulls, such as on a double action semi-automatic handgun. We're not requiring anybody to release a manual safety, such as a 1911, and of course with the old single action Army design Colt, we're not having to manually cock anything. So what it does is as a fighting tool, it's getting down to the bare basics of point, pull the trigger, which is working in conjunction with a lot of other bodily functions that we got going on with our sympathetic nervous system, regulating heartbeat, and all these other things that are going to affect performance. What we're doing is, in the weapon system itself, is trying to eliminate as much as we can that gets us beyond very simple things. So, when we talk about training someone, a Glock is a very simple gun to train someone on. The Smith design striker weapon is very easy to train people on. And we just see a consistency in their bullet placement and their ability to handle the weapon. And also, because the trigger on these type of weapon systems don't require such a long reach, such as in the double action semi-automatic weapons, it allows the person to fit the weapon a little bit easier, which is going to greatly affect their performance and where the bullets go.
That's great. So we're looking at a true grab point shoot gun. We don't have to disengage a manual safety before we can fire. We don't have to drop the hammer with the decocker after we're done shooting. The trigger is consistent from the first shot to the last shot, and the trigger is short and crisp. The only action that we're looking at is the mechanical issues we have to worry about is inserting the magazine and releasing the magazine, or locking the slide, releasing the slide. But there's nothing else to the gun. That's it. It's just a grab point shoot gun. We carry it loaded and ready to go. When we have to engage the threat, all we have to do is grab the gun, point the gun, and shoot the gun. When we're done engaging the threat, all we have to do is take our finger off the trigger and holster the weapon. That's it. Very simple. So now what that takes us to is the gun has to fit our hand properly, and we have to have the proper grip to barrel angle. I think those two issues there are probably the two of the most critical issues that we can worry about when we're selecting a handgun. Now, we need a gun that's mechanically safe and reliable, but if you're using any modern gun that is of a reputable brand, then you're going to have a gun that's safe and reliable. And one of the things that I recommend that, Lou, I know you feel the same way, law enforcement is going to be the greatest source of feedback for how guns operate in the field under real conditions. So if we look towards the models that are vetted through law enforcement, then that kind of gives us confidence that we can say that that model is going to be reliable for us as a carry gun or as a home defense gun, or if we're security and we get to select our own gun, or even if we're already working in law enforcement but the agency gives us a couple choices, which gun can we choose? You know, there may be one model that's already very popular in the field with a great reputation versus maybe a newer model that hasn't been vetted yet, and you might want to steer your option, if you have that choice, to that more vetted option. So I think those things are important. So let's talk very quickly about gun fit, grip to barrel angle, and I also want to talk very quickly about bore line, because one of the things we talk about, Lou, you and I both, is that we want a gun that sits with the barrel, the bore line, close to the hand. Now, this is a really big gun. I bring it out as a great example here, but the barrel sits kind of high to the grip. So what's going to happen now is when I go to shoot the gun, we're going to have to resist more of this type of recoil. And that, again, is something that requires more training, and it's also something that, you know, depending on the individual shooter and how the gun fits their hand, that may be more challenging. If we take a gun like this, you can see that the bore is right into where my hand is. Now I've got a lot of leverage over that barrel. The gun, the recoil is coming more into my hand as opposed to up and back. Lou, would you say that those are accurate statements and things that people need to consider?
Yes, they are. And, you know, when to refine more of what is going on there, you know, the recoil is coming straight back towards your body. The muzzle climb is when your barrel wants to stop pointing in an upward direction. When your hand is more in line with the bore line of that barrel, it's going to resist the muzzle from wanting to climb higher. Now, why is this important to us? Well, if combat shootings are generally close-up affairs that are on the high speed, and we generally are shooting multiple rounds when we get into those type of fights. Well, bullet placement is going to be dependent on how well we can control the factors of recoil and the muzzle climb of that weapon as it's discharging. Now, when we're under true speed, we always use the 5 shots per second type of analogy. 0 being the first shot, and then every quarter of a second till you hit 1 second. Now you're accounting for 5 shots going off within that 1 second time frame. We're not talking about the time it takes to go from, let's say, a holster to eye level, or from a combat ready position with a little raising of the weapon into your line of sight. We're just talking about the 5 shots being discharged, 0 being the first one. Well, when you add in the cumulative effect of those rounds discharging within that short period of time, every advantage that we can get out of the design of the weapon to help us control that muzzle, to hold it within the target area, means more bullets on target and less misses. That means that we can end the fight quicker. That means less liability of rounds going past the desired target, the person we're fighting, and potentially hitting someone downrange, which causes a whole liability issue for us. And it allows us to be a more effective fighter with that tool in our hand. So for someone selecting a weapon, the ability to control it is going to be factored into the type of weapon that you actually choose. If you have a very high bore line to where your hand is, then you're going to have to work more to control that muzzle. And, you know, sometimes you hear the arguments where people say, well, you know, slow down your rate of fire. And I always say, well, good luck with that when someone's 10 feet away from you trying to shoot you to death. There's going to be very little there that's going to slow your trigger finger down. So the issue becomes we have to be using a particular weapon system that, based on us, our grip strength, our ability to hold a weapon in there, you're going to have, you know, differences in what one individual can do to the other. But the one factor that we can control is the initial weapon system itself in regard to its ability to stay more on target via having less muzzle climb. The recoil, if we've got a weapon that fits, is going to come right up our forearm, which isn't going to really be all that much of a problem. The real issue is the muzzle bouncing around as the weapon's discharging. Low bore lines give us a little bit more control.
And I just used a revolver there to demonstrate the higher bore line as opposed to a Glock there that I used to demonstrate the lower bore line. But I don't want anyone to misunderstand. This is not an issue of revolvers versus an automatic. If you have an autoloader, you can also have designs that have a higher bore line. You just want to put it into your hand and look and see how close can we get that bore line to our hand, because the lower that barrel sits in our hand, the more control we're going to have, particularly when we're shooting the gun in a rapid way that's going to require us to keep the barrel from moving as little as possible. When we want to shoot fast, accurate, and consistent, we need the barrel to move as little as possible. Now, another thing we've got to consider here is grip to barrel angle, and this is a really big issue because if you have a gun that is close to a 90-degree angle versus the natural grip, which is closer to 120 degrees. Glocks come close to that at 112 degrees. We want that barrel to point naturally where our eyes look. So if I have a gun in my hand and I'm pointing and that barrel is exactly lined up where my eye is, so that that barrel is naturally pointing where I'm looking, that means when I'm hyper-focused on the threat, I'm not referencing my sights or my optics. I'm going to be able to engage that threat accurately by merely looking at it and naturally pointing, as opposed to referencing my sights or my optics. If I have a barrel and grip angle that's closer to 90 degrees, then what's going to happen is when I'm gripping the gun, the barrel's going to be slightly up, and I'm exaggerating here for effect, but the barrel's going to be slightly up while my eyes are looking straight. Now on the range, people don't notice this because they use their sights and they'll just bring the gun in line with their eye and it's no big deal. But in a real shooting, when they're hyper-focused on the threat, when they're not referencing their sights or their optics, the natural grip is going to place the barrel at an upward angle, and now they're going to be looking straight, but their shots are going to be high and they're going to be missing. So what I always tell my students is, if you can get an airsoft that fits your hand with the same grip to barrel angle as your real gun, then square up to your target, close your eyes, draw your gun, fire 5 shots in a second, open your eyes, and look at where your shots went. That's where you're going to shoot for real, because you're not going to be referencing your sights, and in that case you're going to be aiming based on how the gun fits in your hand. You can do this dry fire, making sure you have an unloaded gun in an ammunition-free area. Get a little bit of distance from a mirror so you're not going to hit the mirror by accident. You can square up to the mirror, close your eyes, draw your gun, open your eyes, and see if the barrel's aligned with your eye or if it's pointing in some other different direction. And that, again, these things not only speak to grip to barrel angle, they also speak to how the gun fits your hand and whether or not you have a proper grip. But you want to be able to have that barrel pointing where you're looking without having to align the barrel with sights or optics, because we know in the majority of shootings people are going to be looking at the problem they're trying to solve. They're not going to be referencing their sights or optics, and so we need the gun to naturally point where we look. We need that proper grip to barrel angle. So if I take something like this, for me, it's going to point where I look. If I take something like a revolver, I just have to be careful that I bring the barrel down aligned with my eye, because the grip to barrel angle is slightly different. So Lou, what are your thoughts on that grip to barrel angle? I really think that's the key, along with proper fit and proper grip. I think that's the key to hitting your target in a real encounter where there's stress involved and things are happening fast.
Well, all of these things that you're talking about are all interrelated. The way that the weapon fits in your hand can alter your muzzle from going right or left, depending on how you have to reach the trigger, depending on the particular design of the weapon may have a fatter grip on it than maybe some other weapon system. And we see that as an element that affects the deflection or the right or left movement of the barrel as it sits in your hand. The other factor is you've alluded to it in the grip angle. But I would also add one more factor into that grip angle. Um, it depends on the back strap itself in the way it fits into your hand. What we mean is that in, let's say, for example, a particular design weapon such as a Glock. Well, when you look at the way that the grip is formed, you'll notice that the on a standard regular production model, the the back strap of it has, for lack of a better way of saying it, has a little bit of a curvature or a hump in it. And depending on where that sits in your hand can actually alter the elevation of that muzzle in relation to your line of sight. I have that personal problem with Glocks. Now, what I've done with my Glocks in order to alleviate that problem is I've had the grip redesigned so that is straight, so that the way my hand is designed and the size of it, when the weapon fits in my hand and it's straight, the muzzle is pointing exactly where I'm looking. When I use a unaltered grip, the muzzle tends to point high for me. In the 1911 design, you'll see that there's interchangeable back straps on it. Some of the more modern striker fire weapons, they actually supply them with varying degrees of curvature for the back strap, so that depending on how it fits in your hand, you're able to alter the way this muzzle is going to be elevated. These are all critical for the factors that you alluded to, as far as when we get down to a lot of the self-defense shootings that are up close, very fast. People are focused on the threat. Where that barrel naturally points is going to really have an effect on where the bullets go, particularly when we get in these less than ideal scenarios where you may have angled shots on someone. They're not in a perfect position like a target is on a range. You may have less space on their body to be able to place the bullets. These are all going to be factors that'll go right back to how that weapon fits via the grip angle, via the way the back strap is made, via the bore line. All of these things are mutually interrelated, and you really have, it's a real hard thing for a lot of people to find that exact weapon that takes all of that into account. Because with most semi-automatic design weapons, you kind of get what it is. However, the industry has gotten a lot better over the years of being able to vary the widths and the back strap itself to help with this problem of muzzle elevation and the deflection right or left.
Well, and that's a great point you bring up about what is a person's individual preference. There is no one gun. There is no one maker model. These are all things that people are going to have to go through and hand select what suits best for them. And then, as you said, they may have a gun that meets a lot of their criteria, but then there may be a modification that they want to make so that now the gun fits even more of their criteria. This right here is a back strap. So this is the back strap of a gun. And you want that back strap to sit as high into the web of your hand as possible, or you want the web of your hand to be as high into the back strap as possible. You definitely don't want any gap, because that gap is space. Space is movement. Movement is the opposite of consistency. When you grip low into the back strap, you've got more of this. When you grip high into the back strap, now you've got more control over the gun. The gun is more stable. The shooting is more consistent. You can shoot faster and more accurate. Lou, let's talk about fit here for a second. I'm going to give a couple brief comparisons. Now, this particular gun right here is a Glock 30. This gun is a little bit wide for my hand. Now, I can control this gun. I'm comfortable with this gun, but this grip is about as wide as I would ever want to have a grip and still feel that I have that confidence and that competence with it. This is a red gun version of a 1911. Now, you can see my hand, because this grip is smaller, I can get more of a grip on this gun. The Glock 19 grip is more comfortable for me than the Glock 30 grip, because it's smaller and I can get more control over it. And when we think about control, what we want to think about is control while shooting, control while retaining the gun from somebody trying to take that gun away from us, take control of that gun from us, and then also we might have to hit somebody with the gun. So as an impact weapon, we also want to have control over the gun. Now, if you look at something like this particular grip is okay. My hand can definitely wrap around it, but it's a very narrow grip. There's not a lot of width. It's longer than it is wide. For this particular grip for me, it's not the most comfortable in the world. It's not a bad gun. It's just not the most comfortable in the world. Now this right here, which is another gun design we'll talk about, this gun again, because it's the way it fits in my hand, the way the length is compared to the width is very comfortable for me. And I had no problem shooting this gun, and I'm very comfortable with it, and I'm very confident with it. When my finger goes on the trigger, even though it's a double action gun, you don't see the hammer, but the trigger is both cocking and releasing it. Because of the way it fits in my hand, I have no problem with that double action trigger. And there are some people that are going to feel the same way when they pick up double action triggers. It's very comfortable for them, and it's not a problem. But the Glock design for me is a trigger that I'm much more comfortable with, shorter and lighter. You can hear the difference. You can see the amount of movement. And the way my hand fits on this trigger is extremely comfortable. Now, a lot of these things are personal choices. You got to feel what's comfortable for you. But I wanted to hold in my hand and show, you know, we're looking at the width, we're looking at the length, we're looking at how it fits your hand. If I don't have the grip extension here, I don't have anything to grab at the bottom. For me, that's uncomfortable. If I put the grip extension in, then now all of a sudden I have all my fingers on the grip and I feel comfortable. For a Glock 19, that wouldn't be an issue because the grip is long enough that my hand is already on the grip. There's no extension that goes with this design. So those are all things you want to think about. The length of the grip in your hand, and also the width of the grip, and also the way the grip is this way, and then the length this way, and how your finger fits on the trigger when you have a proper grip on the gun so that it's aligned with your forearm. Some of the stuff is hard to show backwards here. High up on the back strap, fingers tight up underneath the trigger guard, and I prefer to have my thumb in a forward position so it points where I look. But you want to make sure that the gun is comfortable in your hand. What are some pointers that you would like to give about grip? Because we talk a lot about the gun has to fit properly in the hand, but I want people to understand what that means and to be able to see it and then to feel it in their own hand. And I always tell people, get your hands on as many guns as you can. Take a little time to close your eyes and feel. Something's going to feel like a glove. It's just going to click and it's just going to feel right. And that's definitely a gun that you're going to want to consider during your selection process.
Well, and I think you've hit on pretty much every point that I would want to talk about. But the one thing, in addition to everything that you've said, that I would really advise people to do is, if you think a particular handgun is going to work for you, you're never really going to know that for sure until you take it out and actually shoot it. So if the listener would listen to the things that have been said so far and the things that you just brought forward in the last things that you said, take all of that, go to a range that you can rent various type of handguns, because that's probably the easiest way, unless you know people that will assist you in allowing you to borrow their particular handgun and use it. But you never really know until you're actually putting rounds down range. And you not only have to go out and shoot it, but we also recommend that if at all possible, try to shoot it in the exact way you would use it in a defensive scenario. So anybody could go out and take any handgun, put a target down range, put it up in front of their eye, pick up their front sight, look at it through your rear sight, take 3 seconds or 4 seconds to break the shot, and with using that sight alignment, make up for a lot of the things that you just talked about. But you got to ask yourself, is that really the way things are going to go when I need this weapon to really defend myself? And frankly, the answer is no. So if you're not operating with it at the same speeds and the condition more compatible to the way you're going to use it in a self-defense scenario, you're probably still not going that extra mile to make sure that it's going to work for you. So, what we do is we like to take people out and work drills that are more consistent with the way that they're going to fight with that handgun. So by testing out several different designs under those conditions, you're going to probably get closer to the one that you would most likely want to spend your money on and most likely want to carry.
Yeah, I agree 100%, Lou. And what I recommend is people get their hands on as many guns as they can, narrow it down to the few guns that really fit, but don't buy that gun until you rent it. And I've had people that have held guns and they go, wow, this feels so good. And then they shot it, they're like, oh, I just don't like it. So that little bit of investment is not only an investment to save your money, but more importantly, it's an investment to protect your safety. And because we're getting at about that point where we're going to want to wind this down, Lou, but another thing is the balance of the gun. Some guns are very slide heavy. Some guns are just a balance is not going to feel good for some people, where for somebody else it might feel fine, and that's okay. But feel the gun, see how it feels in your hand, and that's another reason for actually renting the gun too, because you want to not only feel how it is at the counter there or at the Gun and Knife show when you're trying out these different things, but you want to feel what it's like when it's loaded and when you're actually shooting it. And I'm going to give you just another example here when we talk about the placement of our finger on the trigger. You see that right here, my trigger finger is quite a bit further away from my hand than it would be on a smaller gun like this, where now my trigger finger is much closer. And you're going to have to, again, you have to find what's comfortable for you, but you need the leverage with the proper grip to bring the trigger all the way back and all the way forward again through its full range of motion. That's what you're looking for to say that you have the proper grip and proper leverage on the trigger. Now, because we are kind of winding down on time, I think we covered a lot of very important things. We talked about the difference, we showed the difference between a revolver and an autoloader, automatic, semi-automatic. Those are all terms that are used. And then the other thing we showed were the action types with the triggers, where we have the double action, the single action, and then the double single. We talked about manual safeties, and we talked about decockers. We talked about bore line, balance, grip, as far as how it fits in your hand, and also grip the barrel angle. We talked about the fact that we're looking for simplicity and consistency, but I also want to take a little bit of time here, Lou, to talk about this gun right here, which, sometimes people hear us talking and might think that we're critical of revolvers, but I got to tell you, this is one of the guns that I carry, and I love this gun. It's a phenomenal tool. If you know how to use it properly, it gives tremendous tactical advantage. I wouldn't have this as my primary gun per se, but I definitely love this as a second gun. And in many circumstances, this would probably be the gun that I would be deploying, depending on what led me into that engagement in the first place. The reason why I say that, Lou, and we've talked about this before, because I can carry this in a pocket holster, have my hand on the grip of my gun and ready to go, when people have no idea that I'm ready to deploy a gun, that my hand is already on a gun and ready to draw. If I'm carrying my Glock on my waist, I'm not going to be able to get my hand on the grip as a prelude to something that might be bad. If I had to shoot somebody and I've got to get to the gun fast, it's a very fast presentation, but I really won't have the luxury of doing that as kind of, hey, there's this guy in that parking lot I'm not quite sure about, well, I don't just get to put my hand on my gun just in case when it's on my waist and everybody can see that. But when I've got a gun in my pocket, I can get my hand on that gun in the pocket, and then I can very quickly draw that gun, and it puts you in a position where you have so much tactical advantage because you're ready without giving up the element of surprise and without needlessly escalating. Now, with these small revolvers, I would always give people something to consider when you're thinking about an airweight gun is make sure that you shoot it with your self-defense loads before you buy it to make sure that it's comfortable. Because while airweight guns are more comfortable to carry because they weigh less, they have less weight to counter the recoil and are oftentimes less comfortable to shoot. So I recommend, this is a 640, there's a 642, there's different types of gun. This happens to be a Smith & Wesson. Colt and Ruger make phenomenal guns too. But the idea is I would consider a gun like this that, make sure the weight is comfortable, not just for carrying it, but for shooting it. Definitely try your self-defense loads if you're going to think about carrying an airweight. But this type of design is great, and what you see here is that the holster hammer is concealed within the mechanism, so that what happens is if I had this in a coat pocket and I needed to shoot through a coat pocket, there's nothing on this gun that would catch on the clothing to cause it to malfunction. I can shoot this gun from within a coat pocket if I had to, and that again gives me a lot of tactical advantage. Where I don't recommend this as a primary gun, where people oftentimes do, particularly for women, is because the hand strength of activating the trigger can be a little bit hard on some people. And again, we have that grip to barrel angle that's closer to a 90 degrees, so it's not going to point naturally where people look for a lot of folks. So those are all things that you want to vet for yourself. It's a phenomenal weapon. I think as a niche weapon, it's second to none. As a primary gun, I would caution people, and I would caution people, especially if they're thinking about an airweight, just to test it with their self-defense ammo first and make sure that it's comfortable. Lou, what are your thoughts about that?
Well, I carry a pocket revolver as a second gun. Anytime I have a pair of pants on, I have a second revolver as a secondary weapon always present with me. I think everybody that can afford it needs to get some type of similar small revolver like that. There's so many uses for them. Some of the environments we go in, we may not be able to go completely dressed out with all our fuller size weapons and all the normal everyday carry that we like to optimally have on us. What having a revolver like that does for us is when we understand where it fits in to the whole issue of defensive shooting, it gives us probably 5 of the surest shots that you're ever going to have in your life out of any weapon system. And what it does is it gives you a weapon that you can pretty much conceal almost in your underwear if you have to. And this gives you tremendous tactical advantages, and it gives you the ability to always be armed in maybe places where you may not be able to be completely armed with all your everyday carry. So the only thing that we would caution, or I would, in conjunction with what you said about the weight of the particular revolver that you choose in relation to its controllability, is understand, excuse me, understand that where we're going to use this revolver isn't necessarily going to be for 20-yard, 25-yard shooting. We use this type of revolver as a very, very close-range defensive tool. Now, some of the disadvantages that you may have in it can be overcome by some of the advantages that you would have in a given scenario. You alluded to one to be able to when you said, I can have my hand on it without anybody around me knowing. This can be an incredible advantage in some scenarios to where someone that is completely unexpectant of having a gun threat against them via, let's say, their edge weapon threat or even their own gun threat can open up a tactical advantage for you that you may not have even if you have your fuller size weapons, but they're concealed in a place where you can't get to them as fast. That extra advantage of rapid deployment, surprise deployment can make the difference in many scenarios of winning or losing. Also, being able to carry in a less permissive environment because of your dress that you have on might not allow you to carry your normal weapons, such as sometimes in sports coats or other things that you may have on might not conceal it, or you may not be able to go in those environments with that particular weapon. So having a small, in this case, J-frame revolver can open up a lot of tactical advantage. And when you practice it with it, take it into the scenario environment in which you intend to fight with it. Don't put a mission on this weapon that it really was never designed for. This is for close range shooting. It's not saying it can't be accurate out at distance, but that's really not where we're going to be using this type of weapon. And I think if you take that in conjunction with what you said about if you go too light, it might not be comfortable. I think when you marry those two things up, you can come up with a system that'll be viable in a lot of environments for you.
I agree 100%, Lou. And we're at the time now where we should wrap things up. So let me just mention a couple other resources that people have. Podcast number 6, How to Select a Handgun for Self-Defense, and also post number 1, Handgun and Caliber Selection, are 2 resources that you can get at livesafeacademy.com, both our podcast and our article, as a complement or supplement to this video. And if people have any questions, of course, you're always welcome to contact our school, and you can also contact Lou at gunfightersLimited.com. And we're very thankful for the time that you spent here with us today. We hope that we were of service. And Lou, thank you very much for being here today. It's always an honor to have a chance to work with you and bring this information out to the public. I wish everybody the best, stay safe, and have a wonderful day.
Would you like to connect with Live Safe Academy, LLC? Would you like to help us spread the word so we can help more people? Go to livesafeacademy.com/connect to join our email list, subscribe to our podcast on iTunes, subscribe to our YouTube channel, like us on Facebook. Get free safety information and learn more about our classes and premium online learning opportunities. Because you have the right to be safe, no one has the right to hurt you, and you are worth protecting.